and I serve as the chair of the City of Albuquerque Board of Ethics and Campaign Practices. I'm going to go ahead and call our meeting for December 17th to order. We have a relatively short agenda today, so let me start with our usual housekeeping matters. The first item on our agenda is to review and approve the agenda. This was posted by the city clerk in a timely manner. All the members of the board have had the opportunity to review the agenda. Can I have a motion to approve the agenda for today's meeting?
I'll move approval of the agenda for today's meeting.
All right, and is there a second? All right, there's a second by member Marks. So will the city clerk call the roll, please? See, I'm getting better.
Thank you. Member Breen.
Yes, approve minutes.
Member Cadigan.
Yes.
Member Caffrey.
Yes.
Member Marks.
Yes.
And Chair Schultz.
Yes. All right, so the agenda for today's meeting is approved. Now we will move on to the review and approval of the minutes from our last meeting, which was held Friday, December 3rd. All of the board members have had an opportunity to review the draft of those minutes. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
I'll move approval of the minutes.
Thank you. And is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? Right. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll on the question to approve the minutes.
Member Breen.
Ma'am, I'll recuse myself. I was not present for the meeting. Is that okay?
Member Cadigan.
Yes.
Member Caffrey.
Yes.
Member Marks.
Yes.
And Chair Schultz.
Yes. So the minutes from the Friday, December 3rd meeting of our board is approved. We have one action item on today's agenda, and that has to do with some outstanding campaign finance issues. And for purposes of presenting those issues, I will turn to our auditor. So Thad, if I can ask you to present what the issues are before us.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you for letting me present. The campaign issues were outstanding finance reports for Eddie Aragon and in-kind issues. At about 9:15 last night, I got 2 emails that the reports had been filed. And so I got online this morning and reviewed them. The final campaign finance report still showed a balance. However, I am in possession of a copy of a check that was issued to the city of Albuquerque for that exact balance, which means the report does go to zero. We just need to have him file yet one more report showing that final expenditure back to the city. As a result, the final report will zero out, and that issue in my mind is taken care of and doesn't need any further action. The in-kind issue, I haven't received any data on. That is one where I've sent a number of communications detailing the data we need to calculate the fair value of the use of the station, and then just put that in the in-kind section of the report so that that issue is final. I haven't received it. I don't have any data to work with. There's nothing more I can do. And so I'm going to leave this in the board's capable hands and ask that you consider issuing mandatory fines.
Let me ask just a couple of questions and then I'll
Yes,
turn
sir.
it over to the board. So first of all, how long has this issue been outstanding?
Since campaign finance, give me a second, I'm sorry. I issued a findings letter right before a formal complaint came in on the issue. The board received a formal complaint. Do you remember that? I must have issued the letter a few days before that. And then when the formal complaint came out, I stepped aside and waited to see what would happen there. Then when the formal complaint was withdrawn, I sent another letter saying, let's bring back up the issue. Is that your remembrance, Eddie?
Absolutely, 100%.
Okay.
You are not focused on that whatsoever. It became an issue after they withdrew it. And that's what I'm here to address. I think.
Mr.
Well,
Aragon,
hold
can I
on,
ask you-
hold on. We're still
Can
in
I ask
the
you to hold
question
for 1
phase.
second,
Oh,
please?
sure. Yeah, I apologize.
All right. And Thad, do you have a specific recommendation you would want the board to consider with regard to a potential fine?
I would like administrative relief in that he should give data on minutes used, percentage discount. I think they can have a 20% discount on owned businesses. And then the fair value that other candidates would have had to pay for those minutes, and to see if we can get that on his report. If that doesn't happen, then I would like you to impose the maximum fine, because this has been outstanding for quite a while.
And that maximum fine is how much?
I'm sorry, I don't know. I apologize.
Mr. Aragon, before we get to you, are there any questions for Thad from other members of the board?
For Thad or for
This-
Thad?
I'm sorry, who's Jason?
Mr. Chair, this isn't for Thad. This is for yourself or for council. What's the ordinance say about in kind? I'm trying to find it, but
Do you want me to pull
what's the
that up
requirement?
on my screen?
Can the city clerk help us out with that in response to Mr. Marks's question?
Mr. Aragon is showing us something from a.
So I think a lot of the provisions on in-kind are in our rules and regulations. Let me pull those up right quick.
Article 13 defines in-kind contribution as a good or service other than money having monetary value not to exceed the limits set in the rest of Article 13, but not including an individual who volunteers his own personal service.
Good one.
And I'll add that our regulations further state that these are goods or services other than money that are donated or provided to the campaign at no cost or at a cost that is less than the fair market value. And then there's an exception for services provided without compensation or unreimbursed travel or the personal expenses of individuals who volunteer, which isn't relevant here. And there are some provisions in the rules around owned businesses and discounts. And if a person owns a business, in general, the business can provide services, but that needs to be reported as well.
Okay, so you're getting at my question then, Ethan. So, like, I'm a candidate and I drive my personal vehicle around to campaign events. That's not an in-kind. But I'm the sole owner of a business, and my business owns a car, and I drive that around, and it is in-kind.
Can I speak here? Before we jump a little bit?
Everybody, please wait. Mr. Marks is asking a question. We'd like to get an answer to that. Mr. Aragon, you will have an opportunity to speak. We're trying to do this in as orderly a manner as we can. Right now, we're still with Mr. Marks.
Mr. Marks, we haven't come up with that exact fact pattern, but yes, I think in general, if a business is donating its property to a candidate would need to report that.
And in this situation, is Mr. Aragon's radio station does it have other owners? I mean, is it an alter ego of himself? Factually?
That doesn't matter.
Who's saying that?
No. So
It doesn't matter.
I want to try and keep with that before we move on. Ted, do you know the answer to that question or no?
I don't.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Thad before we move on? I do have a proposal on how to proceed, but I do want to make sure we give everybody an opportunity to ask questions.
So Chair Schultz, it sounds like we're doing this in organized fashion, but just so it's clear, I do have questions for Mr. Aragon.
That's fine. Well, I'm trying to go through one witness at a time. Well, presentation.
Mr. Chairman, this is Jim Breen. I have a question.
Yes.
And that would be that, the correspondence that's been exchanged with Mr. Aragon and the board and the city clerk and other parties is relatively vague about which activities would qualify. Eddie runs a radio station that is part of his normal dialogue with his listeners, would probably be part of the job and not really a campaign activity. So I'm wondering if we've provided Mr. Aragon enough direction of which activities would be considered campaign in-kind campaign activities. So I think we probably owe him that at some point.
I agree. The letters were intentionally vague because we've asked him to determine which minutes from his show might be campaigning. When I went back and thought about this, you have to think for a minute. It's impossible for me to go in and listen to every minute of every show during his campaign time. And so without being able to do that, I put the question back to Eddie. How many minutes do you think you spent? And any reasonable estimate was going to work. I think until we amend the rules, it's not possible to come up with a hard figure from our side. So it's important to put it back on him and say, from your side, knowing any other candidate who were to say something on your show would have in kind. Any other candidate you gave airtime to, they would have to recognize their fair value. We expect the same from you. Therefore, you tell us how many minutes and at what value. And so it's a very vague statement intentionally because he's the only one who's going to possibly know. Does that make sense to everybody?
Well, I'd like to make a suggestion. Mr. Marks raised good questions, and Mr. Breen also has raised the issue about what exactly is before us. What I would like to do is have this board set a schedule for presenting this matter in perhaps a more factual and a more coherent manner to the board. And my suggestion would run along, Mr. Aragon. If you let me finish, Mr. Aragon, perhaps this will help. My suggestion would be as follows, that we instruct the auditor to submit a new letter to Mr. Aragon, being as specific as he can with regard to what issues still remain outstanding that he requires more information for, and setting out which portions of the city charter, our rules, and the city clerk's rules he believes could be in violation.
Okay.
We would then give Mr. Aragon a certain period of time in which to respond to that letter, either factually, which perhaps would moot the issue because then the auditor would have the information he needed, or give us his legal basis for not responding or why he believes that a fine would not be appropriate. Once we, in other words, I'm proposing almost a little bit of a do-over, a new letter from the auditor, an opportunity for Mr. Aragon to respond, then this board would have all of that information before it, and we would set this matter for another hearing where we can consider those two pleadings and be able to ask both the auditor and Mr. Aragon questions based on their presentations to the board. That's obviously isn't a motion. This is just a suggestion that I'm throwing out for the board. Mr. Aragon, you've been very patient. Let me ask you to start with your reaction to that type of proposal.
I don't have a reaction to it. That's more litigation. I appreciate you conducting this meeting. I don't know, Mr. Schultz, if you are in receipt of my response to Karen Montoya. She was a complainant in BOE case number 08-2021. It's my understanding that all of the legal documents and anything you might have might be in your possession. I specifically refrained from submitting that per my counsel, because this is, as that is already admitted, or Mr. Porch, excuse me, sorry, I apologize, has already admitted that basically he was waiting for this to finish up before he decided to pursue it on his own. So there was, I appreciate your recommendation because I think it's the right one, but we have a long way to go here in terms of sort of, and I think Mr. Watson and Ms. Deemer would also agree that we've got to go ahead and reform the election code and the clerk's code. So this thing is chock full of those very issues, Mr. Schultz, that you referenced, which I think are all very poignant points. And in my counsel, in going through this and going through the clerk stuff, there are a number of things that, and Mr. Marks, you've addressed, I think, some really good questions here. And Mr. Brain, your points are certainly well taken. I appreciate that, especially from your standpoint. But if I may, in the sake of time, so we don't have to do a board of ethics, I would like to just take the time for about 10 minutes and read some specific points which address all of these, and then you guys have a complete receipt of copy rather than having to spend an additional $9,000 in litigation, which I'm happy to do. And I'm happy to kind of, blow this up in terms of the public discourse about whether or not a broadcaster can use that. I don't know that that's the direction that we want to go here. I think what we want to do is tighten up the code for future. So for example, if I were to run for mayor again, that you would like for me to handle it this way instead of the way that it was handled in 2021. These are all things I think we can pretty much come to an agreement on, because you'll find in the very litigious stuff that we did with Montoya's counsel, where she realized she did not have a case based upon her reading and her attorney's reading of the code. And given the fact that, and in speaking with the mayor himself, as well as his counsel and his campaign counsel, they also are in receipt of this, but the Board of Ethics may not be in receipt of it. It's my understanding that you are in receipt of the actual document that was prepared, which goes chapter and verse on the lies and the laws. Ms. Caffrey, I think, has quoted a different level of code without understanding the nuance between a public and privately financed candidate. So I'd like to ask the board this morning in the reference of time and just for some clarity, and I'm certainly agreeable, Mr. Schultz, to what you're suggesting. If the board, after hearing me speak for 10 minutes on this, would like to open this up for another reissuance of Mr. Porch and now Ms. Montoya. Mr. Porch, in my opinion, is no different. Her complaint is no different than Ms. Montoya's complaint. So I'd like to ask the board this morning, but I'd like to take Mr. Marks's questions first, if I may.
Mr. Aragon, I'd like you to stop at this point. We understand that presentation. What I would like to do is get a sense of how the board wishes to proceed. Does the board want to hear a presentation now and move towards a vote today, or is the board feeling that there is a need for further documentation and presentation with the materials in front of the board, which I'm afraid the board may not have today? So I'd like to open it back to the board to get their sense of how it wishes to proceed.
I guess I'll ask the question. As I understand it, the auditor is looking for the candidate to report his in-kind contributions. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and so we now have these questions of, well, what is an in-kind contribution, and does this item qualify? Does this item qualify? And if we're trying to determine whether something is an in-kind contribution and therefore reportable, sometimes with these things, it's easier to get the largest possible universe and subtract instead of starting with the smallest universe and then adding. So in that sense, it does make sense for the candidate to give us as much information as possible, and then we can have the conversation. Well, is this item an in-kind? Is this item an in-kind? And if necessary, subtract that. But if we start off trying to determine what is an in-kind contribution without having examples from the candidate, then we might be doing it the wrong way. So I suppose it makes sense to me to get a bigger universe of information from the candidate, and then we can go through and categorize the different items.
So I want to make sure I understand. Is it your suggestion that we proceed that way today, or would you prefer to have further submissions?
I would prefer to have further submissions.
Okay. Other members of the board? Again, the question is, how do you want to proceed with for purposes of today? Mr. Marks.
I think it's likely that we're going to need further information, but not for sure. And since we're already here, I would like to hear from Mr. Aragon for 10 minutes, and with you running a clock, so it doesn't drag on. But since we already assembled this morning, I think it would help me understand the issues if we are going to ask for more information to hear what Mr. Aragon has to say about it, since as is obvious, this is somewhat of a unique situation, although not. I mean, it does have, I think what's unique about it is probably there's some First Amendment issues because it's a radio station that might not happen, because if somebody happened to own a print shop or happened to own something else that really directly fed into a campaign. But anyhow, I'd like to hear from Mr. Aragon, and it might help with what comes next.
Mr. Breen and Mr. Cadigan.
This is Jim Breen. I would like to hear from Mr. Aragon, and particularly to the entire group. I still think we should probably consider that the dialogue that he has with his listeners is one thing. I'd be most interested in actual campaign advertisements that were part of his, that came out of his radio station, as opposed to the dialogue that he had with his listeners, because that's part of his show, part of their routine, and I'm not sure that's a in-kind contribution.
Mr. Cadigan.
And if we're going to hear from Mr. Aragon, I would request that he answer one specific question very specifically, and that is, who owns the radio station? Does he actually own it as a person, as a human being, or is there some entity that is the licensee or owner?
Well, there seems to be a consensus that the board would like to hear from Mr. Aragon today. So here is what I propose, that we give Mr. Aragon 10 minutes. I will keep time, and that will be strictly enforced. At the end of Mr. Aragon's presentation, I think what the board needs to consider is, does it feel it has enough information to take a vote today, or will it want some additional information so that it can make a decision at a future meeting? So with that being said, does everyone understand? Any objection? All right, Mr. Aragon, floor is yours.
Before you start the time at 9:25 and 30 seconds, let me answer Mr. Cadigan's.
No, sir, you have 10 minutes, and that's what you requested, and that's what you have. So we will start the clock.
Mr. Cadigan, I'm the owner and licensee of Rock of Talk. So I'm the sole LLC member of that. And then in addition to that, I am the sole licensee of the license for FCC regulated Kiva AM, which we just renewed for another 10 years. First, Mr. Aragon, and this is directly from a document that you'll receive. Mr. Breen and Mr. Marks, I'd love for you to take a look at this. This is page 2. First, Mr. Aragon was exercising his right to freedom of speech by discussing the mayoral race. Ms. Montoya had no basis to hold Mr. Aragon as privately funded candidate to the limitations set for a publicly funded candidate. Kiva donated over 63 hours to the mayoral campaign of Mr. Gonzalez and Mr. Tim Keller. Kiva also donated airtime to candidate Manny Gonzalez himself, which he did not report as in kind or as a donation from me. Ms. Montoya has failed to establish the Aragon campaign any false statement regarding its financial supports. The city website permits a candidate to announce my candidacy for mayor in any manner I wish. How do I wish to announce my candidacy for mayor of city council? This is a personal choice, and the city clerk's office has no regulations regarding announcements. Mr. Aragon informed his listeners about issues affecting the Albuquerque metro area. Thank you, Mr. Ream, to include the mayoral race and city council election. Mr. Aragon reads commentary from his listeners, as well as answers calls during his show. Mr. Aragon sometimes gives his personal opinions about the issues facing Albuquerque by discussing the high crime and murder rates, the insufficiency of the city's efforts to curb crime, and whatever else his listeners ask him to address. As part of his radio show, Mr. Aragon offered the other candidates the opportunity to explain their political positions. Open phone lines, unscreened, they knew that as well. Neither ever did. The decision not to appear on the radio show was their own, and Mr. Aragon shouldn't be penalized for it. As a radio show host, Mr. Aragon has done exactly what the First Amendment of the United States protects. It ensures public access to newsmaker, unquestionably newsworthy information that would help foster uninhibited, robust, and wide open debate on rapidly developing events and unparalleled importance. New York Times Company versus Sullivan, US 254-270, Article 2, Section 14 of the New Mexico Constitution also protects Mr. Aragon's freedom to speak on issues of public importance. The city does not impose limitation on contributions from a privately funded candidate.
Mr. Aragon, could I ask you to slow down just a little?
Yes, sir. If I may.
Kind of hard to hear you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Ms. Montoya, now Mr. Porch avers that Mr. Aragon violated the ethics code because of the value of their airtime should have been reported as in-kind contributions. She also claims under the city's regulations that the limit for in-kind contributions is $6,250 from any individual and $66,130 in-kind, BOE case H21. She does not cite specifically where in the election codes the information is located. You were expecting me to provide that. Ms. Montoya ignored, and now Mr. Porch ignores that Mr. Aragon has at all times been a privately funded candidate. As a privately funded candidate, Mr. Aragon is not bound by the city's public financing requirements. In direct contradiction to Ms. Montoya's claims, Mr. Aragon's contributions to his own campaign are not capped. At no time did Mr. Gonzalez list the Kiva interview as an in-kind contribution or a donation from me in his financial report for this period. Kiva has donated many hours to the mayoral campaign for all candidates. Ms. Montoya's complaint overlooked it. On July 3rd, 2021, we aired a 1-hour interview with Mr. Gonzalez on the Straight Talk with Jeffrey Candelaria show. Mr. Candelaria reached out to Mr. Gonzalez in June. Mr. Gonzalez agreed to interview, see the statement and the exhibit number 1 from Jeff Candelaria. Mr. Gonzalez interview on July 2nd. Mr. Aragon served as a producer for the interview. I did. At no time did Mr. Gonzalez list the Kiva as an in-kind contribution in his financial report during the period. I have a list of all the times that I aired, and we also have submitted this to the Board of Ethics, which you should have received more than a month ago. I'm sorry that that correspondence did not come from Deemer or Watson, the clerk, on that. We also listed every single time that I appeared from the time that I signed up on July 26th to go ahead and start qualifying for petition. Following Ms. Montoya's complaint to a rational conclusion would result in the requirement of all municipal political campaigns to track all audio, as Mr. Breen suggested, and all visual broadcasts for any mention of their campaigns and list all of them as in-kind donations on financial disclosure forms. It is practical and impossible to do so. The contributed Kiva airtime for the 2021 Albuquerque mayoral election was 0. Ms. Montoya alleged, and now Mr. Porch alleges that Mr. Aragon violated Part E and Part G of the election code because he didn't list airtime nor disclose any in-kind contributions from Rock of Top LLC, despite the fact that he is using Kiva radio station on a daily basis, per Breen, to raise funds and support for his candidacy. Mr. Aragon has publicly stated that he owns the radio station, makes his living as a radio personality, and resides at this radio station. The FCC has licensed only Mr. Aragon to operate KIVA. None of these are contributions as defined by the election code in Article 12, not 13, Section 2, Part 2 and 3. The election code specifically states contributions of commercial and professional services shall be attributed a cash value equal to their fair market value. None of the following shall be considered a contribution: a candidate's own services and property other than cash, the use of a dwelling unit and a residential premises incidental thereto for any campaign purpose, and the provision of refreshments and entertainment in connection with such use, the services of a person who is performing the duties of the candidate's treasurer, and the use of vehicles for any campaign purpose other in connection with the performance of a commercial or professional service. 2021 regulations of the Albuquerque City Clerk for the Election Code Part 1, Section 2A. The term quote unquote contribution means a gift, subscription, loan, advance, a deposit, or money, or anything of value made for the purposes of influence a nomination or election of any purpose to the elected office or the purpose of liquidating any campaign deficit of a candidate, except for that loan of money to a candidate by a financial institution in the state made in accordance with applicable banking laws and regulations in the ordinary course of business, not included. So, however, if the airtime cannot be purchased, which we did, you could not purchase it during the mayoral campaign, nor during the city clerk's campaign, or the city council campaign, it is not sold. The cost of Kiva would bear is zero. The fair market value likewise is zero. Kiva did not sell ads to any mayoral candidate. We did not sell them to one city council candidate. We knew this going in and ahead of time for the 2021 race, nor did any candidate request to purchase airtime from KIVA. Kiva did not charge any campaign for airtime. Any in-kind cost is $0. Any contribution is $0. And any in-kind contributions are not subject to the reporting requirements in the election code, not to mention I'm a privately financed candidate. Ms. Montoya, now Mr. Porch, provides no support whatsoever for their estimate of the value of airtime or their analysis of quote unquote what is in kind, according to the election code. When the radio station belongs to the candidate who has donated all airtime to any campaign who wishes to be on, Ms. Montoya does not allege, no, there is no basis whatsoever to believe that the value of Kiva broadcast time was anywhere near any amount that she disclosed or anything that was expected from Mr. Porch doing a required financial disclosure. This information has been submitted directly to Deemer and Watson. You are not in receipt of it because as we anticipated, both my legal counsel and you, that they were not communicating that information directly to you because it was a separate incident. Mr. Porch picked this up where Ms. Montoya left off. If there is a new ethics complaint that's coming forth, we'd be happy to go ahead and litigate that. We are not interested in continuing this further based upon the current election code. I have 2 minutes exactly. What I will tell you is that I think if this is something for the election code for 2025 going forward, that this is something that could be easily remedied. If we were to get together and spend the time to go ahead and tighten that up and the loopholes that we knew that we already jumped through, including the FCC, which is what we had to get through, the Federal Communications Department, and talking directly with them. And I just got my renewal for the radio station, not to mention discussing this with my FCC attorneys in Washington, D.C. Everything that they have read, everything that my attorney, Rosario Vega Lynn, has read, and everything that we've gone through in the election code after spending $16,000 to defend ourselves during 2 Board of Ethics complaints, one from Mr. Montoya, one from Ms. Montoya and the PAC, and the other directly from Mr. Gonzalez, which was a separate thing for where I could go ahead and reside and live and register. This has been a pretty daunting process. I love the city of Albuquerque. I absolutely, really enjoyed this campaign. I'm sorry that we're sitting here at this point, but based upon the election code, regardless if we go ahead and end it here or if we go through further litigation, of which I'm go ahead and having to spend an excess amount of money, and I literally nailed every single, as Miriam Deemer will tell you, I nailed every single signature. Everything was verified. There was no question whatsoever about voter fraud. We did everything above board. My lawyers, including my FCC attorney, my own personal attorney, looked at everything before we went. We have 30 seconds. So I'd just like to thank you guys for the opportunity to go ahead and present this information. I hope that you receive the documentation before deciding whether or not to spend the additional time, money, resources, etc., to go ahead and litigate this and go through this. But based upon the current election code, I can assure you that we will come out clean on the other side, because none of what I have done violates any of the election code. 5 seconds, nor can it be stated that I donated anything to anybody else either. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Aragon. Questions from the board to Mr. Aragon? Mr. Cadigan, and you're on mute.
Mr. Aragon, very specific question for you. I looked at the Secretary of State's website, and you are the organizer of a limited liability company called Rock of Talk LLC. Am I correct that Rock of Talk LLC is the owner of the radio station and the licensee for the radio station?
Eddie Aragon is the licensee and the owner of the operation that runs the radio station, Rock of Talk LLC, of which I'm the sole member. Maybe those documents might not be updated to your satisfaction, but I can make sure that they will be.
No, I just want to be clear. There is a limited liability company called Rock of Talk that owns the radio station. Is that correct?
Correct, of which I'm the sole member of.
That's all. Thank you.
Other board questions for Mr. Aragon? All right, seeing no questions. Oh,
Sorry,
sorry, go ahead.
trying
Sorry, Ms.
to
Caffrey.
phrase this. Okay, so this is from Article 13. It's just the election code. So it's the overarching definition. In-kind contribution means a good or a service other than money having monetary value not to exceed the limit set in Section 4, but not including an individual who volunteers his own personal service. So, Mr. Aragon, are you claiming that you have volunteered your own personal service and therefore it is not an in-kind contribution?
That there's zero value, there's no value, and there's no in-kind contribution. Back to Mr. Breen's point, this is a, let me go back to, I want to answer this exactly how it's written out legally between legal with both and referencing both 12 and 13. At no time was any of this an in-kind contribution because there was zero value attached to it. Neither did we sell or did we receive anything that anybody else would have been able to receive during that time. So there is no value attached to it of the value of the radio station because we did not sell any. And also, so I think somebody else had a question that they were more interested in the amount of commercial time. I did not run one single commercial on my radio station for myself, nor did I create one. So the only commercials that we ran, we purchased on television.
And then how do you think any of your rights would be violated simply by having to report in-kind contributions if your radio time was an in-kind contribution?
Well, again, back to your point that you referenced prior to me making my 10-minute statement, you wanted to look at it from 30,000 feet up and have me assemble and basically do all the work for the Board of Ethics Board and present you that. I'm telling you, based upon your current Board of Ethics, this is not an in-kind contribution, which is where we should start from. We should start from the rule book that Miriam Demon or Ethan Watson handed directly to me on the day that tell me what I can and cannot do. Immediately upon receiving that, I referred that to both my FCC attorney, of which I have one in Washington, D.C., and my local attorney. They looked at it. We knew that what we were dealing with. So none of this would be considered an in-kind contribution. So that's the point I think that we need to take off just so we won't spend any additional time. At no time did Mr. Gonzalez list his quote unquote, my time that I gave him as a in-kind contribution directly to him. So we have to really kind of tighten that up. If this is something that we want to clamp down on and prevent me from using the radio station in the further the way that I used it in 2021, I'm certainly open to that. But based upon the loopholes and based upon the information that is there in your guidebook, there is nothing that prevents me from using the radio station the way that I did, nor do I have to report anything that I did during my time. And in fact, in doing so, if I would have had reported my time as in-kind contribution, Mr. Gonzalez would have to then revise his. Mr. Keller would need to revise his for the donation of 63 hours of time as an in-kind contribution directly to their, and I forgot to mention that point, to their, to their campaigns as well, because it would have been considered a donation because we ran the debates. In fact, a complete list, and that's a good question, Ms. Cappy. Here's a complete list of all the times that we ran the debates. We ran them incessantly, and that was additional time for both Mr. Gonzalez and Mr. Keller. So one thing should be said, and maybe this doesn't really kind of fit in, I was not allowed any time whatsoever on KOB, 770 KKOB, other radio stations in the marketplace, because both Mr. Keller and this is one of the reasons I'm open to going ahead and doing this. Both Mr. Keller and as mayor and Mr. Gonzalez as sheriff. Let me pull this up. You guys will.
I mean, that's,
Let me.
you answered my question, so I really.
Can I
Mr. Aragon,
can I just make
you
one
asked a
real quick?
question and you've answered that question now.
Okay.
Okay. Any other board questions for Mr. Aragon?
Can I make
All right.
one, like 5
No,
seconds?
sir. We asked for 10 minutes. I'd like to continue with this
Right.
meeting. There are no further questions from the board. Let me now return to the members of the board and ask how you wish to proceed at this point. Again, now that we have had the opportunity to hear Mr. Aragon, it seems to me that we either can address the request put forward by the auditor at the beginning of the meeting today, or we can request some further submissions so that we can address it at a later meeting. So I'm opening it to the board for how you wish to proceed. Mr. Marks.
I don't have a entire plan, but I would like to share my thoughts, and I think it will narrow, if other members agree with me, it'll narrow the issues. As Mr. Cadigan was onto it, and I think many of us are, if an individual forms a limited liability company to hold a business, they get certain benefits from doing that. That business is legally a separate entity from them, which can be very beneficial in most ways. Mr. Aragon did that, and his rock of talk and his radio station is not him. He has the benefits of, if somebody sues his radio station, his personal assets are protected, et cetera, et cetera. If we were dealing with a sole proprietorship, it would be more complicated. But I think based on the way the law works 99.9% of the time, and the facts before us, if the radio station provides something to him, it is an in-kind contribution from someone else other than himself. And I think this board could make that legal finding. And we heard Mr. Aragon's arguments to the contrary, but they're not persuasive legally. And so the question becomes, is, in my mind, what of his airtime is an in-kind contribution in terms of having some value? And Mr. Aragon has actually, thought about this a lot, and his thoughts help. He didn't use the term, but those of us who have been in this arena with him know he's talking about earned media, distinguishing earned media from paid media. And if I'm running for office, or when I was running for office, and if I got on KKOB for an hour with Bob Clark or with Jim Villanucci or something, that's earned media. If I'm running for office and I was the incumbent and I was on the TV station talking about, not about my campaign, but talking about what I was doing as the incumbent, or Mayor Keller is on TV all the time talking about, the homeless or whatever, that's earned media. And Mr. Aragon is not correct that, that's reportable, that's distinguishable from advertising. We get to maybe what Mr. Breen was getting at, is it all earned media? And I don't think it all is. As a candidate, and the fact that Mr. Aragon offered time to the other candidates is a demonstration of his character, that he's looking for fairness, but doesn't really, and is, it should be it's commendable, but it doesn't solve his problem. I mean, his problem is that as a radio personality, he could probably donate his own time, but he's got a separate company that's giving him airwaves far in excess of what any candidate ordinarily can have as earned media. And there's some value to that. I disagree with Ms. Aragon that the election code needs to be tied in. I mean, it's an unusual situation, but we probably have everything we need to decide it. I mean, I think I think you can distinguish between earned media, him rerunning his, a debate versus him being able to be on the station for 6 hours a day, talking to people about city issues. That's far and above what any candidate would be able to do with a radio station that had an arm's length relationship with. And the fact that he doesn't sell advertising and there's no value, he says no value, that's not correct. I mean, even if KVIA or whatever it is doesn't normally sell advertising, the fair market value of the time can be established based on what radio stations with similar amounts of listenership would charge if they ran ads, if they do run ads. So I think there is some amount of reportable in kind. The value can be ascertained. I think at the end of the day, I don't know that I would support fining Mr. Aragon, since it's a complex area and he could have gotten more guidance earlier on. But I think this board should issue an opinion that makes clear that a person in this situation will be receiving reportable in kind, which could go up against the limit. And so if this occurs again, whether with him or somebody else, it's crystal clear. And I do think there's enough law on the books already to get to that point.
Okay. Mr. Breen.
Chairman Schultz, members of the board, I'm not convinced that it's possible for Mr. Aragon, in his role as a talk show host, that we can assign that as subject to the reporting of in-kind campaign contributions. I would be mainly interested in legitimate or campaign advertisements that occurred on the Kiva radio station. And I think that's what the board should be focused on, is actual campaign advertisements. His role as a talk host is one thing, and I don't think he can separate the two. So, and I don't think that would be subject to the reporting of in-kind campaign contributions.
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Cadigan or Ms. Caffrey?
I think I agree with Mr. Marks regarding the question of value, separating out the value of time and the value of using the studio equipment, using the whatever equipment broadcasts the signal. That certainly has value. So even if we're not talking about an equivalency in buying airtime, there's an equivalency in renting a broadcast studio, in renting a great microphone that picks up your voice, in renting a broadcast signal. So that has value aside from whether Mr. Aragon's personal time. So there is monetary value. And again, this question of who owns the equipment, who owns the actual space and the microphones and the control board and the broadcast signal and the satellites or whatever, versus Mr. Aragon's ineffable presence. So there is value there, and it's not a personal service. So I think there is definitely some reportable in-kind contributions here.
Okay. And Mr. Cadigan.
not to try to negotiate a case in this situation, but I guess my question to Mr. Aragon, and this is a very simple yes or no question, and I don't think we need any further than a yes or no. Would you be willing, given what you've heard, to simply be given 2 weeks' time to submit an estimate of the number of minutes you used on KIVA to talk about your campaign and to estimate the value to avoid the potential of a violation?
Yes.
Thanks.
All right, so with that answer, Mr. Cadigan, do you have any further comments?
With that, I guess I'll just make this as a motion to save time. I would move that we give Mr. Aragon 14, well, I don't know, 14 business days, since we have a bunch of holidays between now and then, to come forward with an estimate of the number of minutes he used to talk about his campaign on KIVA and the estimated value, and report that to Mr. Porch. And that's it.
Is there a sec, Mr. Aragon, you don't get to vote on this motion. I'm sorry, you're not a member of the board. Is there a second to that motion?
Mark seconds.
All right, so we now have a motion and a second. Mr. Thad, let me ask you a question.
Yep.
If Mr. Aragon, if the board adopted that motion and Mr. Aragon complied with that information, does that resolve your issue?
I'm sorry, sir. I'm going to have to backtrack. I was not in receipt of the information he read. And after hearing it, I'm having a real problem with his First Amendment rights.
No, Thad,
I'm sorry, you're going to have to hear this. I apologize.
No, that's not the question. The question is, if the board adopts Mr. Cadigan's motion and you are provided with that information, does that resolve the issue you initially brought to this board?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So with that, is there any further discussion on this motion?
I have one thing to say.
I'm sorry, Thad.
It's okay. I understand, sir.
You don't get to, you're not a member of the board and you don't get to vote on the motion. So with that being said, is there any further discussion by members of the board on this motion? All right. Seeing none, Miriam, can I ask you to call the roll on the motion?
Yes. Member Breen,
Yay, yes.
Member Cadigan,
Yes.
Member Caffrey,
Yes.
Member Marks,
Aye.
Chair Schultz.
Yes. So, so can I suggest on this motion that we set a date certain rather than number of business days? It's just easier with the holidays. And what if we were to say Friday, January 7th?
Great with me.
I don't know how many business days that is, but it's an easy day to pick. Is that an acceptable day for everyone? Mr. Aragon, is that a doable date for you?
Yes.
Okay.
And Chair Schultz, could I just chime in right quick?
Okay, let's see.
I'm sorry, I'm just clarifying, does the board want to set a meeting on the 7th, or would you like Mr. Aragon
No.
to turn the material in by the 7th and then we'll set a
Correct.
meeting, something like the 21st or something?
There may not be any need for any hearing, any further meeting.
Okay.
So if I understand the motion and I understand the response to the question from the auditor, no later than Friday, January 7th, Mr. Aragon will be providing the material. And can I ask the city clerk to make sure that Mr. Aragon is provided with a copy of the motion that was just passed, so there's no question about what's going to be included? So by Friday, January 7th, Mr. Aragon will comply with that motion and provide that information to the city clerk, which in turn will then provide it to the auditor. And then I will give the auditor until Friday, January 14th to report back as to whether that resolves all of the issues that were brought to the board. Does that seem like a doable timetable in light of the motion that was passed?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I see lots of folks being, lots of nods. So that works for the auditor. Mr. Aragon, I understand that works for you. We appreciate both of your cooperation in that regard. All right. I believe that resolves that item on the agenda. Mr. Aragon, I will give you one chance. We've already voted. We're not considering anything else. If you have a comment, it will need to be very brief.
Thank you for your time. I'll have the information submitted. I'd like to ask Mr. Watson and Ms. And Miriam as well to submit the report that Thad has, which is legal, directly to all of you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
All right. Is there anything further than on that matter? If not, there is nothing more on our agenda. I will be glad to entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to
So
adjourn.
moved.
All right, there's a motion, there's a second, there's lots of smiles. Is there anyone opposed to adjourning? Seeing none, we are adjourned, and may I wish you all a very,
All right, I gotta do the
Oh,
thing.
sorry. I
I'm
didn't do it the
sorry.
right way. Sorry, Mary.
I know. Member Breen,
Yay.
Member Cadigan.
Yes, yes.
Member Caffrey,
Yes.
Member Marks,
Aye.
and Chair Schultz.
Yes.
Thank
All right,
you.
now I'd like to wish you all a very happy holiday season and a healthy new year. And if necessary, we will see you all in 2022. We are adjourned.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, sir.